and I am going to start letting participants in.
Louisa, I can't actually see your screen.
Oh,
It says you've started screen sharing. There it goes. Good.
okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 7th Asia Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum. My name is Luisa, and I will be your technical facilitator today to ensure that you have a smooth experience with Zoom. You are at the session titled Toward Locally Led Adaptation, Fusion of Local and Scientific Knowledge and the Role of Universities in Strengthening Community Resilience. We will begin in just a moment here, but before we get started, we would like to let you know that this meeting will be recorded for documentation purposes. Furthermore, the chat box is available in case you have any questions for the panel, or any perspectives you'd like to share, or if you need to reach out to me for technical assistance. For those of you just joining us, welcome. You are at the session titled Toward Locally Led Adaptation, Fusion of Local and Scientific Knowledge and the Role of Universities in Strengthening Community Resilience. We are about ready to get started. I will now pass the floor to Salim, Director of ICCCAD. Salim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luisa, and let me also welcome everybody to this session as part of the APAN forum. This particular session is toward locally led adaptation, fusion of local and scientific knowledge, and the role of universities in strengthening community resilience. And we are part of the communities stream and communities and local resilience stream. And the enabler is science and assessments. My name is Salim ul Haq. Please call me Salim for our panelists. I'm the director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development at the Independent University in Bangladesh, where I'm speaking from in Dhaka. And it's my pleasure to be the host and moderator of this discussion. The format for this meeting is a panel discussion. We are not having any keynote speeches or presentations. We're just going to have a series of conversations with a very eminent and well-qualified panel of 5 persons. I'll go through their names and introduce them briefly now, but then I will invite each of them to speak and tell us a little bit more about the work that they do in the coming few minutes. And then we will open it up for Q&A questions, which I would ask everybody to put them in the chat box. If you have a question or a comment or some information, or you'd like to share publications or references, please feel free to put them in the chat box. I've asked the panelists to keep an eye on the chat box, and as questions arrive for them, I will give them the floor to respond to them when we come to the Q&A session. So let me briefly introduce our 5 distinguished panelists, and then I will give each of them the floor to tell us a little bit more about what they do. Let me also, before I do that, mention the 3 overarching questions that we put to our panelists and let them pick which ones they want to respond to. The 3 questions we looked at are, firstly, how traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge can be fused and can be answered through action research. How do we design action research for that? The second one is how to expand the collaboration among scientists and researchers with practitioners, and particularly with local communities as well. And thirdly, how to build long-term capacity of the communities to enable them as leaders of locally led adaptation, and what the role can universities play in this regard. Could we go back to the previous slide? I still need to introduce our panelists. So the first panelist is going to be Ugyan Yangchen, who is with the Royal University of Bhutan, joining us from Bhutan. The second one is Glenn Banaguas from the ECRI, the Stat Weather Institute in the Philippines. The third is Sina Lui from the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program, or SPREP. And then the fourth is Joel Rogers from the Educational Partnerships for Innovation in Communities Network, or EPIC. And the fifth and final one is Professor David Lewis from the London School of Economics in London in the United Kingdom, all of whom have a lot of relevant experience in this topic that we are now going to discuss. So with that, let me invite Ugyen to kick us off with some sharing of your experiences of the kind of work that you have been doing in Bhutan at the Royal University of Bhutan. Ugyen?
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to get this opportunity to be one of the panelists here with such an, it's a great honor to me indeed. Coming to my, thank you, at the same time, thank you so much, Dr. Salim, for introducing me. And just to add a little bit on the work that I do here at the colleges, I'm with the College of Natural Resources, which is under Royal University of Bhutan, and I am a lecturer, and I work with Department of Sustainable Development. And besides teaching the Sustainable Development students, I also teach a Masters in Development Practice. So it's more to do with the gender modules and then also development. And then also we need to, I also work on research in some of the basic experimental, I would say very basic experimental research related to soil, and then also social research, and have a good experience with the field work of data collection and all. And then beside that, I'm also coordinating as the Center of Sustainable Mountain Agriculture Coordinator. And it's a, I would say, very young center that was established in 2018, and I'm looking after that. And tomorrow, actually, it's a big day for the center, because we are organizing a small science dialogue, the impact of climate change on mountain livelihood and food security. So that's going to happen tomorrow. So it's quite a big day for me and my team here in the college. And then also, yeah, I'm also part of the LUCCC, a member from Royal University of Bhutan. So thank you so much. I would look forward to have great interaction during this session. Thank you.
Salim, you're muted.
Muted.
Sorry, apologies. So I just wanted to ask a question about your experience in Bhutan, which we are all aware of being one of the most environment-friendly, nature-based countries in the world, and with a lot of indigenous people and knowledge. Maybe share a little bit of your experience working with the indigenous knowledge communities, and how do you interact with them, and how do you bring them into your classroom with your students? That would be an interesting experience for you to share with us, if you don't mind.
Yeah, okay, maybe, sorry, I think I missed that point. Yeah, since RUB is a very young university, and then we are also focusing very much into research. Maybe to share here in today's session, I would like to talk about this field attachment. I would say field attachment, where our students they undergo 2 months attachment in the villages in different parts of the district in the country. So there they first learn about how the local communities are. And then later they actually have to act as a change agent. We call them as a village change agent. And that program started very recently, the village change agent. And then we found over the years very interesting, and then as well as for the students, because they could, based on the situation that is there in the villages, they had to actually innovate, make some innovation, simple innovation in the community, and then actually either they can educate them, create awareness, or sometimes they even used to demonstrate. But these are mostly focused in agriculture, livestock area, and yeah, forestry as well. RNR, we call it as renewable natural resources sector. So these three sectors, our students are working in collaboration with the local communities, and they have brought in some small innovations in the local community by, for instance, helping the individual farmers. They have this polyhouse greenhouses where they are using these PET bottles which can be used as a small what you call place where they could grow vegetables, small vegetables. So these are hung within the greenhouses. So that kind of simple innovation, of course, people might be aware outside Bhutan, but for those community, they found it very, very effective. And also, at the same time, this very simple and essential, but very essential, the waste management techniques. And then also in agriculture, very important is composting, which our farmers are not so much aware. No, they are not. They are taught once or twice, but they are not so much familiar, very much into this kind of practices. So our students were in the field, so they actually very much help these local farmers actually to do this composting, because these are done using all the locally available materials that's there in the community. So these were, I would say, very good, interesting experiences we had in this sector. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Yugen, for sharing those experiences of your students. Let me now turn to our second panelist, Glenn Banaguas from Philippines. Glenn, you want to share your experience? I know the Philippines has a lot of experience in community-based activities, particularly on disaster risk reduction. You want to share some of your experiences in working with them?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Glenn Benaguas. Okay, so the very first program I'm going to present to you is actually the one that I developed long time ago. It called it the Climate Smart Philippines. Now it has become the Climate Smart and Disaster Resilient Philippines, a trip to resilience and sustainability. Now, so what do we do? So how did I come up with this particular? How did I come up with this particular program? The Climate Smart Philippines or Climate Smart Disaster Resilient Philippines is we do a lot of trainings, we do a lot of capacity development, because we do know very much that Philippines is experiences different types of climate and geohazards. Now, part of what we do, all right, that particular program covers 81 provinces, 135 cities, 1,493 municipalities, and 42,028 barangays. And you know very much that for every island, there is a corresponding hazard that we need to address. All right, the hazards that are experiencing in Luzon are totally different, totally different that are being experienced in Visayas and of course in Mindanao. Now, what kind of training that we do? A trip to resiliency and sustainability. T stands for track assessment, R stands for risk assessment, I stands for impact assessment, and P stands for policy analysis or policy assessment. So what do we do in terms of track assessment? So whenever we travel to different areas of the Philippines, we see to it that we need to understand what is the demographics in that particular area, the historical analysis, the climate trends and projections in terms of rainfall and temperature. So we train the local government units, from the national government to the local government units, the academe, all right, the universities and colleges, the civil society organizations, the non-government organizations, the community of farmers, fisher folks, indigenous people, the youth, the women, the church leaders, and of course, even the private sector on how they're going to understand how to perform climate projections in the year 2020, 2050, 2080, and 2100. And that has to be part of the project that they're going to develop. Now, R is also part of the training. R stands for the risk assessment, wherein we're using the IPCC and the UNISDR, now the UNDRR framework, where risk is assessed as a function of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. And that is also the framework that we provide, that kind of training that we provide to our local communities. I stands for impact assessment. So it's not enough to understand the track assessment. It's not enough to understand what is going to happen in the future in terms of rainfall and temperature projection. It's not enough to understand the different climate risks. It is also important the actual experiences of the people. So in the impact assessment, the one that I developed, which is now being used in the whole country, which has been extended into the ASEAN region, is we perform the biophysical assessment, we perform a socio-economic assessment. And in 2013, when Super Typhoon Haiyan or Yolanda made its landfall, so science was no longer there. There was there was water sufficiency, there was food insecurity, and it took 3 months before electricity came in. So during our focus group discussions, during our interviews with the different stakeholders, we found out that it was religiosity and spirituality that made them survive. It was their faith. That's why part of an adaptation solution, an adaptation option, whenever we do the rollout, whenever we conduct this particular training, is we always integrate the religiosity, spirituality as an option, an adaptation option. And the other one is the psychological impacts, because that is really very important. So that's part of the impact assessment. Now the other one is P, policy analysis. We want to make sure that the projects or the programs that are going to be developed in a certain municipality or in a certain city, we want to make sure that they are aligned to the international and national frameworks. They have to address, they are not business as usual projects. These have to be climate change adaptation solutions that will really address the impacts and risks of one particular province, city, or municipality. That's all. Thank you very much. Sorry, I talked too much.
Not at all, Glenn. Very interesting. We will come back to you to learn a little bit more about how you do that in practice
Sure.
at the local level.
Thank you very much.
But let me move on now to Sina, whose job title, Sina, your job title is Climate Traditional Knowledge Officer in the Climate Change Resilience Program at SPREP. So I think, we would love to hear from you how you are bringing in traditional knowledge to tackle climate change. Sina, please. You have to unmute yourself. You need to unmute.
Yeah.
Yep. Go ahead.
Talofa, good evening, good morning to everyone. Greetings from Apia, Samoa. And as you've alluded to, I have one of the best and most exciting job titles, which is the Climate Traditional Knowledge Officer. So my work in SPREP is part of the support that we provide to 14 of our national meteorological services. So we have an Australian funded program which works closely with the National Meteorological Services and Hydrological Services to systematically collect traditional knowledge pertaining to weather, climate, forecasting systems. And it was very interesting because in the beginning, when the project was, the program first started, it only focused on just the weather and climate forecasting aspects. But along the way, as we were working with communities and civil societies, we realized that there were also, it wasn't just the climate and weather stories, we were also collecting a lot of response stories. So the program has extended to that work collecting all disaster-related traditional knowledge. And from this collection, the systematic approach undertaking as part of our work, we've realized that in a lot of the stories that knowledge that we've collected, there were so many gaps within the stories that a lot of the stories that we've already come across are part of the story, not the full story. So that's the work that we're now implementing in 8 of the Pacific Island countries, where we're working closely with communities and national stakeholders to make sure that we're collecting useful information, and also being careful that there is the sensitivity and ownership, and that we don't encroach on the rights of the traditional knowledge holders. So that's some of the work that we do here in the Pacific and also at SPREP.
Great, thank you very much, Sina. We also have a very great interest in the use of storytelling in sharing knowledge from across the world amongst people, and something that we would be very interested in exploring with you later, and maybe I'll ask you a question about it later. But let me invite now our next panelist, Professor Joel Rogers, who is in fact the Noam Chomsky Professor of Law, Political Science, Public Affairs, and Sociology at University of Wisconsin-Madison in the US, and also chair of the Educational Partnership for Innovation in Communities, EPIC network. I know EPIC has been doing quite a lot of work of collaboration between universities and city governments in particular. Joel, would you like to share some of your experiences in the EPIC partnership that you've been running for some time now? Joel?
Well, EPIC, I don't know how well it's known to everyone on the panel or in the audience, but EPIC is a network of about now 70 universities that do a model of university community engagement, which is distinctive in its simplicity and its efficiency. It basically matches community needs to classes that are currently being taught at universities, and then gives students some credit for working on those needs as part of their coursework. And right now, I guess we've done about 1,700 projects, and you can go onto our website and see what we did. And they range over a vast range of issues. We don't do projects that do not, in our view, advance progress on the SDGs. But we've worked in about 300 different communities, usually working with governments, but often with community organizations as well. And on your questions, all the EPIC projects are driven from the communities. And so from the very beginning, we hear about their local knowledge and local needs are what drive the project selection in the first place. Is that enough, Salim? Or I go on forever about this, but I want to keep it.
Let me probe you a little bit, Joel. Can you give us a couple of examples, maybe?
Oh, well, we do work on a fair amount of work around civil engineering concerns, redesigning streets or streetscapes, slowing traffic to reduce fatalities. We do a bunch of work around using nature-based resilience in different ways to repair pollution in surface waters, or in some cases groundwaters. We do a fair amount of stuff with city services, lots of projects around either financing or the behavior of actors doing the services. For example, in police, that's a big issue in the US, as I'm sure you've read from the headlines. A lot of cities are very interested in what the best practice, what the best framing is, how to get the evidence on better police community engagement. The range of projects is really so diverse that it defies easy summary. We don't concentrate in any particular one of the 17 SDGs. Education would be one that we always work on, or very often work on, assuring equality in educational access. That's something that comes to mind right now, because I'm working on a few of them right now.
Excellent. Great. Thank you very much. Also, let me just remind all our viewers and attendees that the chat box is open for people to make contributions or ask questions. And we've already got a few examples from Durban, Lusaka, and Nairobi of the EPIC programs there from your colleague, Sean O'Donoghue. So thank you very much, Sean, for providing. Sean's up with us as well. So that's good. And let me invite everybody else who was listening, if you have questions, to put them in the chat box, or if you have information you'd like to share, please feel free to do that, and let us have a conversation with people, both using the chat box as well as our microphones to speak. So let me now move to our fifth and final panelist, who is Professor David Lewis from the London School of Economics. David, I know you've been doing some research. In fact, my colleagues at ICCCAD have been collaborating with you at looking at incentives or lack of incentives for academics in universities to step out of academia and actually engage with practical action people or communities on the ground. It tends not to be encouraged because the academic requirements are just publish papers and then go on to the next paper and don't do much about engaging with audiences. So what is your experience and what are your recommendations, David? You have to unmute.
David, you're still muted.
Yep.
Sorry,
Go
that
ahead.
is my first mistake. That's what happens when you wake up early in the morning. We've been looking at the experiences of university-based researchers engaging beyond the walls of the university. And this is a study that we've undertaken with 10 researchers across 4 different countries in the global north and the global south. So we've looked at a university in Uganda, in East Africa. We've looked at a university in Bangladesh. We've looked at a university in Germany and also my own university, the LSE. And we've talked to researchers about how they go about engaging, whether they go about engaging, and inviting them to reflect on whether or not that engagement has worked or not. And the sorts of conclusions that we've been coming to are quite interesting because we don't think people have done much of this kind of study before. And as Salim mentioned, one of the issues that really comes across is the way that many universities don't really offer incentives for this kind of work. Certainly not in universities like mine, where people have very heavy teaching loads, there are constraints on resources, and actually engagement is not really rewarded in terms of individual promotion or university prestige. And actually there was recently an interesting piece of work done on these, you know, how universities are now becoming obsessed with international league tables where everybody, you know, there's so many of them, but none of them have as a criteria the idea of either policy engagement or community engagement as a good thing that might give a university prestige or make it attractive, you know, to students or funders. So we found a range of different constraints. You know, those incentive issues are one. In countries, in universities in the global south, we found that another problem was around resources. And we found that it's often the case that university researchers are competing for limited resources with NGOs or civil society organizations in order to undertake this kind of work. We also found that quite a lot of university researchers are not that well informed about how what we're calling in the study the worlds of policy work. So actually having good information and maps of the landscape out there beyond the university and how to engage with it was another factor.
Great, thank you, David. There's a question in the chat box already for you saying whether you found any major differences between the North and South universities.
Yeah, that's interesting. Any differences in how engagements happen? I think, yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we found in both North and South was that very often contact is initiated by policymakers rather than by researchers. So people, you know, people tend to wait until they're approached, or the, you know, it's initiated that way. Whether there's a difference in North and South, I think in the South, you often, you know, we found that the role of donors is an important one, you know, for better or for worse, in initiating these kinds of engagements.
Great. Thank you. So thank you all, the panelists, for a good first round of comments and information sharing. I'll now do another round with each of you. And we have an excellent question actually for all of you, which is that from Albert Salamanca, who is asking for all panelists, what do you think are the key challenges for locally led adaptation and the role of universities or researchers from the perspective of where you are in terms of the work that you are doing? So maybe I'll ask each of you to spend a couple of minutes reflecting your own experiences in the challenges that you face in bringing the world of science and research together with the world of action, particularly local level action of communities themselves. Ugyen, you want to share experience from Bhutan?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Salim, for this opportunity. And thank you so much, Albert, for posting this question to all of us. My personal experience with regard to this, key challenges for locally led adaptation, and how, as a university faculty, the challenges that we are facing when we want to work with our local communities. I would very much agree with Professor David, who had actually very interestingly presented his finding about the global South and North. And it's very true. And this is what actually we experience in the university. We are heavily loaded with teaching. And then for me, like this semester also, I have 15 hours of teaching. And at the same time, I'm also very much engaged in tomorrow's conference preparation. And of course, we have a team, but still, you have to be on the top of your toes. And many research works that is like supervision and my own research are pending, and we are not able to complete on time. Now, coming back to this, working with the communities is first thing. The challenge that we face is we have to compete definitely for the limited resources that's available from the funding agency. And then there are so many the interested, I would say, institutions who also wants to work with the local communities because there is fund there. But as a university faculty, we don't get ample time to actually prepare and then at the same time give our 100% because we have equally challenging workload that is here in our college, in the university. And the second thing is the projects are always time bound, and then we cannot actually experiment or we cannot like implement what we are thinking because one thing is lack of resources is there, and then and particularly with the developing country, we have issues with procurement, and we don't get things on time, and we also need to follow certain rules and regulation of our own country. Like if I give an example the recent example I have is I'm also looking after this Sun Space project, which is an EU funded project, and we have 8 partners in total from the developed countries and the developing country. So it's a smart agriculture, a smart farming project where we want to bring sustainable production of agriculture farming practices in our own, what you call the university local area. But the problem is we have lots of challenges with the procurement. We do not get what actually we actually plan in principle. But and then the equipment procurement is a problem. Then we also have to face challenge with the financial rules and the regulation, and we also need to at the same time follow the requirements, fulfill the requirements of the funding agencies. So these are the things, and then the project that I'm looking after right now, the Sun Space project. So there also we have lots of hiccups, and then we actually want to benefit the local community which is around, which is near our college, so that they could see they could experience, learn with the training that we plan to provide. What are the available technology which is there in farming, so that they could make their farms climate resilient, even though it's not sophisticated. It's simple technique like drip irrigations, some simple sensors where we know in agriculture there is lack of labor. There is labor shortage in the farm. So how can we help our local farmers to overcome this labor shortage in terms of irrigation and many more? So this is very much true. And then I think this is the experience that I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much again. Those are extremely important and relevant for us as we go forward as well. Let me move to Glenn. Glenn, you've already done quite a lot of work in Philippines. What would you characterize as the challenge at the moment? You've overcome quite a few challenges already, but what is the biggest challenge you're facing now?
Well, just to share what we have done in the Philippines, all right? Well, it's really part of advocacy, all right? I have 45 junior research scientists, and these are undergraduates. They are not masters, they are not PhD holders. Part of what we do in my research team or in our research center, first is they have to have a heart for change. They have to have a heart to reach out to our marginalized sectors in the Philippines, because Philippines is an agricultural land. We have lots of farmers, we have lots of fishermen, and we have lots of indigenous people. And would you believe, all right, honestly, we do it for free, all right? We are not getting any funding from any international organizations. Since there is a heart on it, whenever we travel to different areas, we want to make sure that it is not just a school activity. We do it because we want to help our communities in the Philippines. Just to give you some updates, we were able to capacitate more than 700 national government agencies, local government units in the Philippines, more than 200 universities and colleges, more than 200 CSOs, NGOs, communities of farmers, fisher folks, indigenous people, the youth and the women, and more than 200 members of the private sector. So how do we do that? Because we really apply the participatory action research wherein we want to get the inputs from different stakeholders. Now, what is the problem? Now, the problem is we're used to the top-down approach. We have the national policy, and how is it going to be mainstream? And whenever we go around, whenever we travel to the different islands, to the remote islands and 5th, 6th class municipalities, people will tell us, sir, we are not aware of this particular policy. We don't know the type of project we're going to develop. And part of what we do is, all right, we want to understand, all right? We want to understand what is really happening on the ground. And you can only do that by using participatory approaches. Now, another thing, the models that we develop in the university, all right, for example, climate modeling, you cannot perform climate modeling in the community, all right? What we do is we do the climate models using the GCMs, global climate models in the university. And in order for us to support if these particular models are correct, you have to go down. You have to go to the grassroots level. You have to conduct interviews. You have to perform participatory action research in order to support if these climate models are correct or not. And that's the solution why the indigenous knowledge or the knowledge in the ground is very important. So it's just a matter of understanding what the quantitative results are giving you, and of course they have to coincide to the qualitative using participatory action research. The results that have to be integrated or have to be collided, and that's what we do in the Philippines. So maybe if you're gonna ask me, so what are the challenges? Telling them, especially teaching the communities on how to do climate modeling. Honestly, if our indigenous people can perform basic climate modeling to understand what's going to happen in the future, in the year 2050, 2080, 2100. So definitely it will be easier for us to teach our local government units. And that's the thing that we always tell them. And part of the empowerment that we provide to the communities, because you know what, every time we travel, people will say, sir, we're not scientists like you. Sir, we're not engineers like you. And part of the empowerment that we provide, it's really an approach of a heart. All right, that's what we do. Is we want to let them feel that even though there are farmers, there are fisher folks, indigenous people, they can always make a difference as long as they put their heart on it. They have the passion to do the change. They have the conviction to make a difference. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Glenn. I think that's a very, very important point. And I think, if you look at the people that David Lewis, interviewed and colleagues interviewed, the ones that actually did it because they had the heart to do it. They didn't have incentives to do it. They just wanted to do it. They felt like doing it, even if they weren't necessarily given the resources or even recognition to do it. So I think that's a very, very important element as we take this issue forward. Let me move to Sina and pick up on this question again about challenges, but let me frame it slightly differently for you, in that, you know, in the Pacific, you've already done quite a lot, and you have a very strong base of indigenous knowledge which you shared with us, and also the storytelling. So this is a challenge that, you know, we face ourselves, and I'm just sharing with it, and I'd like your advice on how you have tried to deal with it. As I said, we pay a lot of importance to listening to the stories of the communities. But then, as Glenn also mentioned, you know, the stories are not always scientifically valid or correct. And how do we then enable them to add to the story, fill the gaps in the stories, and enhance the level of knowledge? So how do we marry, you know, scientific knowledge that we, the scientists, have, or we think we have, and the knowledge that we are hearing from them through their stories, because their mode of telling us their stories. How do we communicate these two different languages? You know, the language of science and the language of individual people telling their own stories. It's a challenge I find a lot, and I'd love to hear your experience on is it a challenge for you, and if so, what advice do you have for us to deal with it?
Yeah, thank you, Salim. I think the benefit that we've had is that we've actually started and starting with a methodology, which is developing a standardized questionnaire. Then we're making sure that we're asking the same questions across the Pacific Island countries. One of the things that we've come across, and yes, storytelling is very much part of our of how we record our or tell our stories. That's where the records or observations they are stored in the storytelling. However, we've noticed from the engagement with communities and elders, we've noticed that while the storytelling is almost like a snapshot of the observations at the time. What the problem that's happening right now is that the story, that same snapshot has been passed through generations. However, there hasn't been checks, and that's where science comes in. So, for example, in Vanuatu and in Samoa, Tonga, there are examples of stories that people think are no longer valid. So for instance, we use a lot of indicators, and these are environmental indicators, plants, flowering of plants, or when we see certain species fruiting abundantly, it tells us that there will be, for example, in a lot of the Pacific communities, when there is there's an abundance of mangoes fruiting, it tells us that there will be a very active cyclone season. There'll be lots of storms. However, we haven't really checked. So the story is still being passed on. But the mangoes, they're reacting to a different, there has been so many changes to climate patterns that now we have mangoes flowering and fruiting all year round. So it's not that the story is wrong. The forecasting or the response element is still relevant. It's just that we haven't updated. And that's where the science comes in. So the work that we're doing is actually collecting the traditional knowledge, and then we store it in a database. And from there, we then monitor the warning aspect. So not the whole story. We look at the indicator. So for example, here in the Pacific, a lot of, you often hear that during the cyclone, often communities will observe the frigate bird. And when you see and now some of the behaviors are determined by availability of food, and we don't know enough to actually double check with our other colleagues in other areas who are more familiar, they probably can provide some of the answers as to why behavior of certain indicators have changed. We're seeing for a lot of the storytelling and some of the stories that we're hearing, we're only hearing part of the story. And often we dismiss that knowledge, saying it no longer works. So that's where science, having a standardized and having a systematic approach in the work that we've done, and especially collecting weather and climate knowledge, we're able to have a method that we can sift through and then look at whether there's a correlation between the forecasting part that can also, that's related to the climate. For example, just recently, we're seeing here in Samoa, and this is across the region, it's La Nina. And for some of you who may not be familiar with La Nina, it's part of the Southern Oscillation, which these are huge climate drivers in our region. And we're seeing pumpkins, for example, fruiting beyond the season that normally, and we're seeing a whole lot of different behaviors, which we find would be are some of the a lot of the environmental indicators are reacting, but the story hasn't been updated. So the work that we do, and hopefully engage some of the universities, and this is where some of the gaps, we're identifying a lot of the gaps where our national universities can take part. However, like some of our panelists have mentioned, there are time bounds, but also often when we develop projects while we're collecting traditional knowledge, usually we realize at the end that we should have engaged some of our national universities, that the research needs to be carried beyond the life of projects.
Right. Great,
Yeah.
thank you.
So that's, yes.
Thank you very much, Sina. In fact, you know, when I'm listening to each of you, I'm thinking about things we can potentially collaborate on going forward. So I'm putting that on our list. We have a series of voices from the front lines that we collect stories from different people. We'd love to hear some from the Pacific from you, and I'll follow up after the meeting with you. Let me now move on to Joel and ask, frame the question slightly differently, since you're in a university. What have you found in your experience has been able to incentivize the academics in the universities to step out of their research confines and engage with practitioners in the local cities and towns where they have been developing these joint EPIC projects? Is it just the opportunity of getting funding for a project that incentivizes them, or is there other motives, or are there other motives that drive them towards doing this? Joel?
Well, the basic motive is sort of what Glenn talked about. You have to have a little bit of heart. You have to have some little bit of concern, at least, even as an academic, to do the work at all. But what EPIC tries to do is to make it as easy as possible. I mean, I haven't seen David's study or if you published the results yet, but I think universities and communities or their governments have very distinct organizational cultures. And one of the reasons why this obvious two-sided market of the network of researchers and students at universities and the network of community organizations and advocates and governments at the community end is very seldom closed effectively, is that they have very different incentives and drivers on both sides. So what EPIC tries to do is to overcome that problem by not really trying to change those two different cultures. We work within established institutions at the university and established universities or established institutions let's use government as an example. So at the university, we work with existing classes that professors are already on the hook to teach. And so you don't need to persuade them to teach the class. You simply need to ask them, is there anything in this class that relates to this set of problems that we've gotten from the community? If they say no, that's the end of that discussion. If they say yes, you say, is there anything you think your students under your very expert instruction might contribute to that? If they say no, that's the end of that discussion. If they say yes, then you say, okay, what exactly? And they tell you, and then you go back to the let's say the government again and say, would this be useful to you? If they say no, that's the end of that discussion. That back and forth until you get something that a professor already committed to teaching a bunch of students under his or her expert guidance can assure you that those students are able to provide that the community says is of interest to them. That's when you get the beginning of an EPIC project. And then we spend a huge amount of time doing root cause analysis on both sides to make sure that we've got everyone understanding each other. And at the government side, you don't say, okay, we want you to completely change the way that you're currently running your transportation system, or give up all of your obligations for public safety, or not run for re-election with elected officials. You should never get between an elected official and an election. You say, okay, given what you're already doing, are there any problems that are keeping you up at night that you know you want to do, but don't have current capacity or bandwidth to make progress on? Because I may have some help for you. Mm-hmm. The basic problem between universities and communities, I find, is the professors are not well trained in talking to other people. I mean, they do not know the technologies of participation particularly well. They don't know really how to run a meeting with ordinary people. They know how to beat up graduate students and know something about how to write. But they're sort of pre-social. And I say this as a professor. And then they're used to dealing with communities either as guinea pigs or corpses, as objects of experimentation or simple analysis. The idea of actually engaging with a community is something that is often foreign in the academic thing. So I'll stop talking, but I think it all begins with respect. If there's some way in which you can build respect for the people that you're allegedly trying to assist in some way in, and insist on that in the culture of the EPIC program, which we certainly try to do, that's where it begins. Because no one cares what you know until they know how much you actually care. That goes back to Glenn's thing about the heart.
Nice one. Very nice one, Joel. Thank you very much. So let me move on to David and ask the same question in slightly different a manner for you, David, given Joel's experience as well. I know you've been engaging with practitioners and policymakers, particularly here in Bangladesh. You have a long history. You've written books about it. My question to you is, how do you share that enthusiasm and incentivize your younger colleagues who are, starting their careers as academics to share that passion and that heart, as Glenn calls it, to reach out and do things that are beyond simply academic research, which is what they are being asked to do from the universities, and do something more with their heart rather than their heads. What's your advice to young colleagues? You need to unmute again.
David, you got to unmute your phone again. That's your second mistake. Come on, David, unmute your phone. You can do it.
There you are. You done it.
Yeah,
well done.
So the reason I can't unmute is because it's giving me a message to say that the host can't unmute. So every time I hit the unmute, it's telling me that I can't unmute. So I don't know what that is. Anyway, I'm very sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good, good. I think maybe the host needs to unmute me for some reason. No, these are, I mean, let me just say that it's an incredibly interesting discussion, and my mind is really sparking from what everybody's been talking about, because I think it really is one of the really pressing problems that we have to think about in universities, and I don't think we're really tackling it. So, I mean, on one level, I think this idea of traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge, we have to be very careful of, because although it means something, you know, we know what we're talking about when we use those distinctions, actually, it's not, I don't think it's a valid way of thinking, because there's really only knowledge. And what we're really talking about is how knowledge is organized, what status is given to it, and the power relations that exist around the validity and use of knowledge. So the challenge really is about democratizing knowledge and thinking about who owns it, who values it, who uses it. And I think we have to have these discussions in universities. We have to have them in development organizations, and we have to have them at community level as well. So, I mean, the question on what one, you know, how one talks to sort of colleagues about this, I mean, that's a very interesting and a challenging question. I think we have to, as universities, think about how we recruit people. I think we have to recruit the kind of people who are already showing evidence of that heart, if you like, that we've all started talking about. And I think we're beginning to do that. I think the current movement around decolonizing knowledge and universities is interesting about that, because I think that is having some effects about universities thinking a little bit more carefully about who are they recruiting. Are they simply recruiting people who are younger models of the same type of people who exist already, or are they diversifying? You know, are they thinking differently? The only other thing I think, I mean, I could talk about this for hours, and I know that time is limited, but I think one of the pieces of advice I would give to a younger colleague is to think long term about engagement, and to think about the idea that it's not a sort of zero-sum game between you either do research and it's valued and you publish it in academic journals and your career progresses, or you get involved in doing community-based work or policy advocacy and your work is not valued. We somehow have to overcome that binary as well. And just very occasionally, I've come across some interesting examples of individual academics who have got involved in a longer term. I mean, in one case I can think of was a consultancy. And normally in our study, we found that consultancies were very often very short-term instrumental pieces of research without really looking at the big picture. They might have some very positive outcomes, but they're not the basis of a long-term relationship. But just occasionally one comes across, you know, a long-term framework in which researchers are able to undertake applied work, but with the recognition that, you know, both sides are going to want to get different things out of it, that the researcher is going to want to think about some of the more pure research theoretical issues that arise, and should have the freedom to be able to pursue those and perhaps write something a bit more theoretical, whereas at the same time be able to think about joint problem solving and do more practical work. And I think if we can somehow find ways to fit all that together in ways that make the different parties to the relationship feel that it's useful, and recognize, the differences that different partners bring to the table. I think that's a good way, to go. An old friend of mine, Adil Najam, recently wrote that the world of science is fundamentally at odds with the world of policy. Science is about understanding things and policy is about getting things done. Well, I think that's a reasonable statement, to make. And unless we actually recognize that, then when we come together to engage, we have to be careful that one side doesn't feel disappointed because we're looking for slightly different things. But there's a huge amount of overlap and common ground and potential for synergy there that I think we need to think about. I'm going to mute myself now and hope that I can unmute next time.
Thank you very much, David. Well done. So we're now coming towards the end of our allotted time. I'm going to invite each of the speakers to give us some final thoughts. And before I do that, let me just point to a few of the excellent questions that have come up in the chat box. One of them is from Drupad, raises the question of, farmers and indigenous peoples can't afford to fail, which researchers can. So they need to be, less risk determined. Also, questions of trust between the community and the researchers is an important one to establish going forward. And then a third question with regards to the role of NGOs as intermediaries between researchers and communities. So, and the final question from my side to each of you, as you wrap up your comments in the next sort of 2 minutes or so each, is where do you think we can go from here? Both from your perspective, the kind of work you're doing, what is it that you will be looking to do going forward? And let me start again with Ugyen, and we'll go in the same order as before. Ugyen?
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Salim. So from my perspective, what I feel as a faculty here in the university, of course, we have lots of challenges. There are some facts where the university is criticized, but what I felt that our university can actually contribute would be to actually go on for the adoption of community, and I feel like this model would be very much sustainable, where we adopt community in and around the university, because what you call the services of any kind that in the capacity of university can be provided constantly, be it monitoring, evaluation, and then we could also work very closely with these communities, and then it should not be time bound or what you call, like, it should not be based on the funding organization, but rather the university should be constantly based on we should also at the same time think about the bottom-up approach, where the local communities should be equally engaged in what are the needs so that their community become climate resilient at the end. And then so in this way, like, if such model is actually adopted, and at the same time, I would also say, like, we should not be working only with the local community and the university together, but also because there are lots of strength from other stakeholders or institutions like NGOs, which very much shared in the chat that NGOs, they have their own strength, which I think the university won't have. So in that way, I would say that collaboration among these researchers, at the same time practitioners, the NGOs, and then local communities and the universities, if you all come together, and then at the same time you also adopt the communities, which where the university can play a very active role along with the local communities who are not to be a beneficiaries, but rather they also become a change agent in that community, then I think this really would go on for a long time, and then benefit a lot in making the community climate resilient. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much. Glenn, please.
Yeah, yes, thank you very much. Okay, for the second and for the last question, I forgot to mention I'm also the chairman of the ASEAN Science Diplomats. So science diplomacy is very important. It was mentioned here. So are you going to communicate science to the public? That's what I have been doing. That's what I've been doing for the last 5 years. If you're a science diplomat or a climate diplomat, in the science diplomacy program that I developed for the ASEAN, we train outstanding scientists and engineers in Southeast Asia on how they're going to communicate science to the public and how this particular science is going to be integrated into the policy. And we have been doing that because the problem is, yes, the real problem is the science is there. And if you go down to the grassroots level, people will not understand if you talk about technical terms. They will not understand what you're talking about. And especially if you're going to build a certain project in that community. And that's the reason why the scientists and engineers have to be capacitated, have to be trained on how they're going to communicate their science to the public. So in one of my experiences, for 5 years, I bring them, all right, our scientists and engineers, I bring them to the local communities. I bring them to the community of farmers. I bring them to the community of fisher folks. I bring them to the community of indigenous people, and they were able to what? They were able to develop a certain tool that is going to be shared with the policymakers. That's one of the outputs of the science diplomacy program. And what is the difference of the science diplomacy program that we develop in Southeast Asia compared to any science diplomats in other parts of the world? In the ASEAN or the Asian science diplomats, we have a heart. Again, I'm going to really to emphasize that we have a heart for change. So meaning you are not only into the top-down approach. Now, if you really want to provide some inputs to our policymakers, well, you should understand what is really happening on the ground and use science. All right, use science to integrate them to the policy. Now, another thing in terms of collaboration, right? We did a lot of collaborations. You're not only collaborating with the local communities, you're not only establishing or strengthening your collaboration with your co-scientists, you also have to collaborate with the private sector. Because for instance, if a certain project cannot be done or cannot be financed by a certain university, that's where the private sector can come in. You just have to understand, you just have to choose the buzzwords, all right? And you really have to win their hearts in order to support your project, in order to support your advocacy. So establishing a long-term capacity for the communities, you don't just have to go there to perform your task. You don't go to the communities because you just want to finish the project. There should be a sustainable exit plan. You have to let them feel that they have the value to solve the problem before you exit or before you leave the particular project. Because part of the empowerment, part of establishing a long-term capacity with the communities is to let them feel that they have the value to solve a specific problem. And that's the real heart for change. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Glenn. Excellent lessons for all of us to learn and take forward.
Thank you.
Sina, some last thoughts from your side.
Yeah, thank you. From the work and from the experience here in the Pacific, we know that traditional knowledge has a lot of insight that can inform a lot of the adaptation practices. Traditional knowledge has value in that it is localized and has been practiced over years. So it does and can inform the interventions that we make. It can inform policies. Also, when traditional knowledge is integrated or fused with science, one can help accelerate each other. It can also help elevate. And those are the key things that we can take on board when we're planning or when we're engaging communities. And also, one of the questions that I saw raised is the fact that a lot of the communities, they don't see a lot of the benefits, and that's where the collaboration and engagement really needs to address, is that there has to be a systematic approach that considers the sensitivity of traditional knowledge. It also considers that there is benefit sharing, that when you take information from communities, that you go back and verify and inform them, let them know that the work or the knowledge that has been taken or used during the project, there are updates. And these are simple things that we can help. Even using terminology, these are some of the things from our experience we find has been one of the key things in the collaborations and partnerships. It allows for ongoing engagement from communities when they see how using local language to be integrated into warning systems, for example, into simple things like translation of directions, winds. These are things that when you take it back to communities, that's acknowledging and taking back the benefits to communities. And one of the questions, points that we need, that was raised is where to from here, going forward. From a SPREP perspective and from the work that we do, I think this discussion is exactly where we would like to move forward, and that is engaging national universities. So far, the work has been mainly just between National Met Services, NGOs, but we haven't really actively engaged national universities. So I've learned quite a lot of points from this panel and also the participants from the chat, and hopefully moving forward that we can find more ways to engage and continue to have a longer collaboration with national universities. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sina. And we will definitely follow up with you because we run a network of universities in the least developed countries, and there are several LDCs in the Pacific region that we engage with. Let me move on now to Joel. Any last thoughts from your side?
Well, a couple of thoughts. One, on preparing the people that we work with at the university for collaboration with the community. That itself is some work that we try to do. We try to get them, you'd be surprised or not surprised how little they know about the communities that they're asking their students now to work in. And so we try to offer them any number of trainings, background briefings, et cetera, on where they're going or where they're sending these students. But, you know, as you know, it's pretty hard to boss faculty around. And so we try to do a fairly light touch. All faculty suffer from a case of ADD, not attention deficit disorder, but authority defiance disorder. They're in this business because they don't want to wear any other person's collar, and they really value their independence. So we try to respect that while suggesting to them they might have a little bit to learn. And for any sort of organization, I think we know the rules of what makes successful organizations. You've got to make them safe places. In this case, safe for community people or government people, as well as the faculty, safe all around. You know, we don't like to have canceling lots of activity. You have to be able to show vulnerability on both sides. People have to feel safe enough to show what they don't know and to admit fear before you get to the hope. And then you got to have some real purpose. In our case, the purpose is pretty clear. We want to save this earth. We want to save the biosphere. We want to increase human flourishing and expand the fantastic potential for human flourishing. So the purpose is fine. The details comes with the people, of course. But the second thing, you know, if you want to use the university, I think you want to use lots of universities and get some of the tremendous both expertise and tremendous amounts of student goodwill that exists at universities. I think it makes sense to do something like what we're trying to do, which you can do not in the alternative of what you're doing now, but something that's a very light, very simple structure that gives it to all faculty, all students. You know, it's available all the time. Rules of competing for the service are pretty clear to communities, et cetera. So I would encourage you all just to check out the EPIC-N website, epicn.org, and take a look and kick the tires. But on your big question about what should we do now, it's an enormous problem. And I think what we need to do is not be discouraged by it. Don't be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief and all the horrors that are coming our way. Try to, do some justice now, love kindness now, and stay humble. But the best way to get started, it's a giant elephant, and you eat it by eating one bite at a time. I mean, start with what some community wants to do and do it well there and develop their trust over time. Oh, and then finally on the engagement. Yeah, I don't believe in going into and out of a community over the course of one semester and think that you've done anything at all. Most of our engagements go over many years.
Excellent. Great. Thank you very much, Joel, for those excellent words of wisdom and advice for all of us as we go forward. David, any last thoughts from your side?
Well, I've learned such a huge amount. See how I unmuted myself that time?
You did indeed. Yes, well done.
You learned. You learned.
Yeah. No, I've learned a huge amount. I mean, I think I really want to echo a few of those points. I mean, one of them is this lack of knowledge in universities about how to engage. That's where we've got to build capacity. And, the Paris Agreement talks about capacity building as a priority. Universities need to, they need to sort of pay more attention to that and get involved in, in a reflection about how to do this better. I also really liked what Glenn said about the private sector. Actually, one of the lessons that comes out of our study across all 4 contexts is the relative lack of engagement amongst researchers with the private sector. They're not bad at engaging with government. They quite like engaging with civil society, but when it comes to business, certainly in these cases, I'm sure that's not true across all scientific disciplines, but there seems to be a gap there, and that's really something that we should be looking at. I think we also have to really pay attention to these problems around extractive research and extractive engagements. I think when we're talking about being involved with communities, we have to really ask the difficult questions about who benefits, who controls resources. And, that leads me really to, I think, one overreaching point here, which is that I've increasingly come to think that conceptualizing all of this in terms of a gap between traditional or scientific knowledge, or a gap between universities and communities, or a gap between the findings of research and the policymakers that we want to pay attention or use them. That gap thinking isn't, I think, the right way to think. I think we have to think much more in terms of co-production and partnership and exchange. In other words, universities are part of these communities. Researchers are, the agendas of researchers are already embedded in policy worlds. They're not 2 separate things. We have to somehow bring this together, and we have to think about how we co-produce research approaches, research agendas, and identify the challenges and the solutions to problems. I think that would be what I would really urge. Also, I think this idea of the knowledge broker, I think there's been a lot of talk about knowledge brokerage and knowledge broker roles if you look at a lot of the literature, but in our study, we didn't really find a huge amount of evidence of that going on, or knowledge brokerage within universities. And I really like that idea of science diplomacy, that Glenn was talking about, that the idea that that's a really good example of a knowledge broker role in which we are sort of thinking about how knowledge is produced and how it's supplied and how it's communicated in new ways, and we're thinking creatively about that. So I think those are just a few slightly random points that I would finish with.
Excellent. Thank you very much, David. So we are now coming to the end of our session, and I'd like to thank all 5 of our excellent speakers and panelists for sharing your thoughts and having an excellent conversation. Also, to those of you who have been engaging with us in the chat box. It's been a lively discussion going on there as well. Very much appreciate that. So before I conclude, let me just share my concluding thoughts and takeaway messages on what I've heard, which reflects something of what David just said. I would distinguish it into three arenas. The first one being the knowledge arena. So the concepts of traditional knowledge, local knowledge, scientific knowledge, we tend to think of them, as David says, as different domains, but there are significant overlaps there. And we need to recognize the merits of each, the limits of each. And one of the key features of that recognition is the forms of communication that are used in each. The forms are very different. And unless we understand the forms of communication, then when we try to communicate across the divides, it becomes not as easy as it should be. The second arena, I would say, is at the level of people. And this is where I take very much Glenn's advice and his experience of heart. It is people as people. We are engaging not as a scientist or a farmer or a fisher or a local elected official. We are humans. We are individuals. We are part of society. We have common desires, aims, views on what needs to be done for our families, for our communities. And that, to me, brings the personal volition, the heart, and the humility and the solidarity of working with other people across divides, not just with our own smaller community, whether we be academics or we be practitioners. We can cross the divide as human beings and across continents, indeed, in fact, not just even in local circumstances. So how does one then engender that, support that, enable that, and particularly for younger people? And particularly for those of us who teach young people in our students in universities, how do we inculcate that in our students? Because they have it. This is really, it's not something we have to create. Many students have that, but we need to support and engender it, which unfortunately, the way we teach doesn't always do that. It makes them, selfish creatures wanting to get good grades and good jobs, but it doesn't make them or encourage them to be good members of the community. And then the third and final arena is that in all the examples we've had here are obviously people who have actually done things, to whom we are preaching to the converted. And so the question now is, how do we take this forward? And there are two dimensions on which we need to be thinking about doing this. Firstly, the time scale. So as has been pointed out time and again by several speakers, you can't do this in a projectized or a one semester exercise with students. You have to have a longer term commitment from everybody concerned in order to build on. You can use the short-term consultancies or short-term projects to build on, but you have to have a long-term commitment to taking it forward in order for it to have any kind of real impact over time. Only time will allow that to happen. It is time consuming. Engaging with people takes time. One of the reasons why it's a disincentive for researchers to do it. It eats up a lot of time. The second dimension is geographic, or scaling out and sharing that experience and knowledge. And that's where webinars and sessions like this come in. We're hearing from the Pacific Islands, from the UK, from America, from Bhutan, from Bangladesh. There is actually a lot in common. There's a lot of specificity to each place, but there's also quite a lot in common that we can share across the continents and across this divide. And how do we do that? How do we do that more effectively? To me, that's my challenge to myself, of how do we stay in touch with each other, communicate with each other, continue to support each other in ways that we might be able to both benefit, win-wins for both sides to do that. And so let me end by not only thanking each of you, but also promising to be in touch with you bilaterally and take this conversation forward and see ways in which we can continue our conversations and potential collaboration going forward. So I'll stop there and hand over to the organizers for any last housekeeping comments that they may have. Anybody from our
Yes, I'm
organizing
here.
team? Yes, Lucy.
Thank you.
Luisa,
Thank you
please
to
go ahead.
everyone for attending today's session as part of the 7th Asia Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum. Please join us for key messages of day 3, and then immediately after we will be having the side event titled Partnerships to Harmonize Science, Information and Knowledge at Regional Scales for Enabling Adaptation, alongside a parallel origami night. You can find the link to join these sessions by returning to the sessions tab on the APAN Forum Conference community on Hubelo. Within the community, you can also explore the exhibitions as well as chat or set up meetings with your conference attendees. Join the conversation on social media using the hashtag APAN2020. Thank you once again for your participation, and we'll see you in the next sessions.